Right, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Prema George. I am the Certification Director at Eastwards. Thank you for joining today's webinar update from the COP15 Basel meeting in Geneva. So some of you may already know that Basel Action Network, as we know as BAN, has been at the forefront of bringing attention to e-waste dumping since 2001. So Jim Puckett, Director of the Basel Action Network, our speaker for the day, has been part of Basel from the beginning of the convention itself. So BAN was the first organization to go to China and discover the e-waste dumping and made the video Exporting Harm. Those of you who haven't seen it, it's still available on our website. You can take a look at that. So we then formulated the Eastwards standard and the certification program to make sure that people are responsibly managing e-waste. So now that Jim is freshly back from the 2021-22 conferences of the parties of the Basel Convention, we could all benefit from his update that will cover what was adopted specific to transboundary movement of e-waste and what is yet to be done. So at the end of this webinar, we will take questions from you. You can type them in the chat window. You can raise your hand in the end, or if time doesn't permit, you can also email us your questions and we will be happy to answer them. So this webinar is recorded for the benefit of everybody, and it will be posted on our website so you can see it later. So, and we do hope that this session is very useful for you. Now over to Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Prema. Yeah, thank you everybody for joining. I just got back from Geneva, 2 weeks worth of meetings. Pretty excruciating to be in meetings that long, working late hours till like 11 midnight on negotiations in those small working groups. The reason these meetings now last so long is they're 3 conventions, the Chemicals and Waste Treaties, Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm, all together intertwined within the 2 weeks. And I've had the misfortune or privilege, however you look at it, of being to 15 of these meetings. And I'm here to tell you about the developments that with regard to e-waste that took place at this meeting. It was pretty important. So first, though, I would like to show you the agenda of today's talk. And first, we're going to start with a chronology of e-waste, and particularly e-waste in the Basel Convention. Then I'm going to talk about the real centerpiece of what happened, the Swiss-Ghanaian e-waste amendment. Then I'm going to talk about another amendment that needs to happen to close the repairable claim loophole, a remaining loophole that needs to be worked on. And then briefly about the need to improve the PIC procedure, which everyone perceives as something that has to be done. And then we'll follow with questions and discussion. So first, the chronology. We've been at this since the beginning of this being considered an issue. You can see me there 20 years ago in China, in Guiyu, when we went there and documented what was happening with so much of our e-waste. And for the first time, Western eyes were able to see, oh my God, this is what's happening with it. Following that expose, the very first thing that happened was some partnerships sprang out of the Basel Convention, and an independent one out of the United Nations University called STEP. And then that was followed in 2009 to 2012 with recycler certifications. Of course, there's Eastwards, our certification, there's R2. In Europe, WELABEX came about, which is now evolved into the Sinelex standard. We followed that up, the work in China, with a similar expose in Western Africa called The Digital Dump, again, a film and a report by the same name, which showed that this phenomenon of waste trade of electronics was spanning another continent, slightly different. More of the abuse was about reuse, saying that this stuff was being exported not for materials recovery, but for repair and reuse, but the same basic dynamic of exploiting weaker economies. That was followed by the Nairobi Declaration at COP8 of the Basel Convention in 2006. Nairobi Declaration was all about e-waste and what the parties of the Basel Convention were going to do about it. At that meeting, the European Commission offered €1 million to work on the African e-waste project. I think it was largely based on our film, and we're quite proud that that took place, and that project spanned about 3 years of work, education, etc. in Africa. Then in America, we knew about the 60 Minutes piece, because that was when it really got to be a critical mass of the public understanding this issue, or at least the decision makers and politicians. That wasteland show, 8 million people saw it the first time. It was re-aired a few times, won a lot of awards, and was highly influential. That was followed finally by Guiyu, the area we discovered in China, finally closing its doors. And to kind of demonstrate what that meant and visually, these are chimneys all down the streets of this town of Guiyu. They had retrofitted chimneys to burn circuit boards inside and try to vent the toxic fumes outside. And here you can see the outside of those chimneys. This is what was happening on the inside of those chimneys. Mostly women were cooking circuit boards. Here she's dealing with a television board and cooking it in the solders, the lead tin fumes flowing out, hopefully out the window, but a lot of exposure to the workers. And this is the symbolic scene of Guiyu after it closed in 2015. Those chimneys plugged up. And I went through the town and took a lot of pictures of the plugged chimneys to demonstrate the change that took place by order of the Chinese government finally in 2015, 14 years after we had exposed it. Then the trade started going all over the place. Here in Africa, in Tanzania, we can see the marketplace where people are trying to repair things. And it was at 2011 that, unfortunately, in our view, the reparables loophole was proposed in a guideline, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And that ensued, what ensued from that is a technical guideline battle. It's never been fully adopted because the technical guideline has that reparables loophole in it, and a lot of parties are not happy with that. Meanwhile, after China said no more Guiyu, what happened was a lot of the electronic waste went to Hong Kong, which used to be the staging place for smuggling it into mainland China. But those staging facilities, what I would call e-waste junkyards, sprang up into the activity of actually trying to do the breakdown and materials recovery of the electronics. So these sprang up all over Hong Kong, and we found them by using our GPS tracking, and we're able to find about 25 different facilities that we then alerted the government to, and they followed by closing them down in 2018. So then the trade moved to Southeast Asia. And here you see a Thai facility that we found by virtue of GPS tracking in the middle of the rural area on farmland, dairy cattle nearby, impacting the food chain of Thailand, going right into the dairy products. And here you can see basically what they were doing was dismantling by hand with workers from Burma and burning them in this very crude smelter, burning the circuit boards. After that, even though China had shut down the Guiyu and started clamping down on the smuggling of electronics, they passed a more sweeping policy, which we all know about, known as National Sword, which blocked all scrap coming into China. And that really changed things, not just with electronics, but plastics, paper, etc. Following that, Thailand was getting the brunt of a lot of the shifting of the market from China to Southeast Asia, and they decided to ban e-waste imports. And then in 2020, we had the Swiss-Ghanaian governments proposing the Swiss-Ghana Amendment, which we'll talk about a lot today. And at this last meeting I just was at, very important, two things happened which I think are very significant. 22 developing parties took the floor demanding work on reforming the technical guideline. So that's the issue of that reparables loophole. They want to see it closed. And that was a pretty significant moment when 22 countries took the floor one after another. And then, of course, the passage of the Swiss-Ghana proposal. So, talking about that Swiss-Ghanaian e-waste amendment, basically 3 listings were changed. So the listings are in the annexes of what defines a hazardous waste or a non-hazardous waste, etc. So what Swiss-Ghana does, and it will do, is replace the old listing of hazardous e-waste with a new one. It will remove the old listing for non-hazardous e-waste and completely eliminate it. And it will establish a new listing on Annex 2 for everything not in the hazardous waste listing. Annex 2 is a special list of waste for special consideration, which we'll talk about. And then finally, it's important to know that this amendment, all of these changes will not happen and not enter into force until January 1, 2025. So why was this done? Very similar to the logic of putting plastics that are dirty and mixed onto Annex 2. So much of the electronic waste actually is plastic, so it's very similar logic. And the logic is that even non-hazardous e-waste and plastics have a horrible track record of only being partially recycled after export and likely to be dumped and burned. They're difficult to recycle, they're not economic to recycle all parts of it, so they get cherry picked and a lot of the stuff ends up as fallout and it's dumped and burned. So it also places this e-waste, even if it's non-hazardous, under control procedures. So the governments know what's coming. There's transparency through the prior informed consent mechanism, and they have the right to refuse entry if they don't like it. So that's the thrust of the Basel Convention itself. And very importantly, it's not so easy to tell what's a hazardous e-waste and what is not. And doing those tests is very expensive, and that burden for that expense falls disproportionately on developing countries that don't have that kind of resource. And so this makes it a lot easier for enforcement. And it also looks to a future where hopefully more and more electronic waste will be non-hazardous, but unfortunately can still create tremendous problems upon export to developing countries. And I would like to say it benefits legitimate recyclers by ensuring they will not have to compete with the package ship brokers, traders, what I call fake recyclers. It's interesting that Ghana was one of the proponents of this with Switzerland, because we have found at Ghana that this is the classic case where we found horrible contamination. The study was done with chicken eggs. They went into the slums of Agbogbloshie area where all this e-waste is burned, and found some of the highest levels ever recorded of brominated dioxins in the chicken eggs, which are being consumed in those slums. So that could easily be non-hazardous electronics. The plastics are considered non-hazardous normally, and when they're burned, they create a horrible hazard, probably more hazardous than what's normally considered hazardous electronics from the heavy metals, because you're talking about dioxins and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and heavy metals. So very important. The old entry of hazardous electronic waste is going to be replaced. In the old entry, it used some arcane language like accumulators and activated glass and talked about PCBs. It's a little outdated, and the important thing to know about any of the entries about hazardous waste in the convention is what I've highlighted here. It needs to have an Annex 1 constituent like cadmium, mercury, lead, to an extent that it's going to create a hazardous characteristic like toxic, ecotoxic, carcinogenic, what have you. So those are the fundaments, and everything else is kind of examples where electronics cross that line. So that's the old definition. The new one, kind of similar, different examples. I put in gray here just examples. And the fundament really is Annex 1 and Annex 3 again, but they have divvied this up into 3 major categories, which the bullet marker indicates. And the first category is broken into 2. So the first category is waste electronic and electronic equipment. So think of that as whole equipment that hasn't been broken down. So that is broken into 2 categories: anything containing or contaminated with these hazards, and B, anything with a component that's has those hazardous characteristics. So they were worried that someone would say, oh, the component is not to be counted in what's hazardous. So they just were very careful to say that equipment that has these contaminants in it, these hazardous constituents, but also containing a component that has them as well. So it's a little bit redundant, but they were trying to cover absolutely everything. So that's the first bullet, which is the whole equipment. And these have a lot of examples, and they fought really hard over these examples, probably like 2 days talking about the examples. It was crazy, but that's what they came up with. Those are just examples. And then we go to the other 2 bullets. Waste components, so it can be a component separated from the whole equipment. Again, is Annex 1, Annex 3 at the same time. And finally, waste arising from the processing. So this could be shredded material, fractions, all kinds of things. So they're trying to be really comprehensive, covering everything that comes from electronics, even if it's been partially processed. And that is what is going to be considered hazardous. And of course, they have some language here about unless covered by another entry on List A. List A is the examples of hazardous waste streams. So they're just trying to avoid ambiguity and redundancy by having something listed twice. So the first listing will preside. And then we got this new entry, Y49, which can be considered everything else. And they put that on Annex 2. And there are some slight exceptions, so it's not quite everything else. We insisted on those exceptions. We'll talk about that in a minute. So everything else is on Annex 2. And what about Annex 2? It has not been used very much for years, or not been changed. It sat there for years and years. And then in 2019, we added dirty and mixed plastics to it. But what characterizes Annex 2, what makes it special, is that things on there are neither asserted as being hazardous or non-hazardous. They're just considered waste for special consideration, or also known as other waste under the convention. But they're in need of controls nevertheless. And this is usually due to the likelihood of improper management or the difficulty in managing these waste streams. They're not covered by the Basel Ban Amendment, which is the ban on the export from developed to developing countries of all hazardous waste. So they're not covered under that ban. The default control procedure for Annex 2 is prior informed consent. So the exporting country must, before exporting, notify the receiving country, get their consent before it can move. Basic control procedure. And in the EU, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and I believe Norway, Annex 2, though, are banned from export to non-OECD countries. So when they implemented the ban amendment, which I mentioned 2 bullets above, they included Annex 2, those countries. But that is not required under the international treaty. And trade with the US or other non-parties, the US is very special because they create the most waste per capita, but they're not a party to this convention. That trade is normally illegal for Basel parties. So that's very important aspect to realize with respect to the Swiss-Ghanaian proposal. So other countries are not normally going to be allowed to receive these Annex 2 Y49 listings from the US. So in the past, we had on this list just 2 entries: waste collected from households, that's household garbage, residues arising from the incineration of household waste. And then in 2019, we added mixed and contaminated plastics. That's a very long definition. So I put it in quotes there. That's a paraphrase of what we're controlling. And now Y49. So Swiss-Ghanaian, the real change with Swiss-Ghana is Y49. And Y49 is basically looking at the definition that I just mentioned, the new definition, and putting knots in front of it. So it's the reverse. It's the opposite. They call this a mirror entry. It's a mirror not because it's identical. It's a mirror because it's opposite. So the not containing and not contaminated, in which none of the components. So this is just mirroring what they've already decided were hazardous. And what is in green there is really important. So BAN insisted on this. It wasn't clear before we insisted on it that we want the processing materials that are already on Annex B of non-hazardous waste to be exempt, so that if a recycler makes a clean stream of metal, that will not be caught up in this definition, for example. We'll talk about those exemptions in a minute. So there it says, unless covered by another entry in Annex 2 or by an entry in Annex 9. So that's the non-hazardous waste streams that are not controlled. So they would be exempt. So that was a big concern. And that's why we insisted on the language to address that concern. Now let's look at those exemptions, because I know a lot of people on the call are in the recycling industry and they want to know what is exempt here, what is not going to be controlled at all. And so real quickly, it's a bit technical, but B1010 are metals and metal alloy wastes in non-dispersible form, excluding mercury. So to be exempt, you must be non-hazardous. For example, not failing the T-clip test for lead, no shredded mercury or lead, etc. Cannot contain brominated flame retardants nor flammable solvents, as in lithium-ion batteries. Cannot have circuit board material. Cannot have dust or granular material. Needs to be chunks of metal, basically. That's that non-dispersible. But it can be mixed metals. So you can have aluminum and copper together. So those would be seen as truly non-hazardous and exempt from controls. Another example would be the B3011 clean and unmixed plastics. The only mixture allowed is PET, PP, and PE. All else have to be sorted to a single polymer, such as HDPE. They must be non-hazardous. So example, no brominated flame retardants in the plastics. And they also have to be pretty clean, so free of non-target substances, free of wood, paper, and other polymers that are not the target polymer that you've identified. So cannot contain PVC or other halogenated plastics either. So that's basically, in sum, the definition of B3011, which was passed in 2019. Then we have B1040, scrap assemblies from electric power generation. Again, they can't be hazardous, can't have PCBs, PCTs, cannot fail a T-clip. We have waste batteries, excluding any with lead, cadmium, or mercury. Again, cannot fail a T-clip test, for example. So we're basically talking alkaline batteries there. Those are exempt. Then we have waste metal cables coated or insulated with plastics. They can't be the hazardous cables that are on A1190 that have like lead in them, for example, lead in the plastics housings of the cables. And they can't be going for final disposal. They got to be going for recycling, and they can't be thermal recycling. So basically, we're talking about mechanical stripping. So those are some of the exemptions that recyclers are able to process things to that level of cleanliness and purity, and then they can go ahead. So getting back to what it means for different geographies of the world, if you're in the EU, what it means is that all the e-waste cannot be exported to non-Annex 7 countries, because again, they have included this in the ban to non-OECD countries, which are non-Annex 7 countries basically, unless they processed it into an Annex 9 waste, those exemptions I mentioned. So we can be imported from Basel parties into the EU or traded within the EU with the PIC procedure. And if the OECD adopts the new Y49 listing, then trade in all e-waste can take place between the European OECD, all of them are OECD, and even including the US if the OECD accepts it, but it will have to be in accordance with the OECD Council decisions version of PIC. So it's a streamlined PIC procedure. So for the US, which I'm sure most of the audience is in the US at the moment, what it means is that non-OECD Basel parties, let's say for example Malaysia, they will not be able to legally import any of this Y49 from the US. So even if it's hazardous, A1181 or Y49, any of that, they can't allow it into their country unless it is one of these exempt listings that are already on Annex 9, which I mentioned. So Basel parties will not be exporting Y49 waste to the US unless it is first processed into Annex 9 waste. So that's waste coming toward the US. Again, that will be barred because of the party-non-party prohibition. And then again, if the OECD adopts the new Y49 listing, then the trade with OECD countries with the US will be fine with the tacit consent procedure. And for the OECD, they will automatically adopt this new rule. That's how it works, unless there's an objection. As we know, the US objected to the plastic amendments that took place in 2019 at COP15, and that created a lot of confusion. I hope that doesn't happen again, but it could. And this will allow trade between OECD countries if the OECD is able to adopt it and there's no objections. So that'll allow the US to trade with Mexico, Canada, Europe, for example, Japan, as long as you have the streamlined PIC procedure, and we're talking Y49 again. So exports of all e-waste from the OECD group to non-OECD Basel parties will require the PIC procedure under Basel, except there will be a ban, again, from the EU countries and Norway, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, and US exports to Basel parties will be seen as illegal by those Basel parties. A little bit technical, isn't it? What it means for the non-OECD will be they will only be able to import Y49 from Basel parties with the PIC procedure unless, again, they've been pre-processed into an Annex 9 waste. And non-OECD will only be allowed to export e-waste to Basel parties with the PIC procedure, again, unless it's been pre-processed into an Annex 9 waste. So that's it for Swiss-Ghana. Save your questions on that because I want to speak a little bit about the last remaining loophole we need to close. And this is the technical guideline paragraph 32B, which we're saying needs to be improved or removed. And what that does is it sounds great from one perspective because we all want to encourage reuse and repair. But with respect to abuse, because you need to write rules for the worst actors, not the best, it just is a huge gaping loophole. And we'll talk about why that's so problematic. But it basically says any export that you claim is going for failure analysis or repair or refurbishment can fall outside of the scope of the convention. And you have to just meet 5 very loosey-goosey requirements to exercise that loophole. And those requirements I'll go through so you can see how unfortunately loose and useless they are if you're really a bad actor. So the trader must claim that the non-functional electronic equipment is being exported for failure analysis or repair. That's the first criteria. And one can do this even if it will not be repaired because nobody is ever going to check. You have no transparency, you have no legal framework to even prosecute anybody. So who's ever going to find out? Second requirement, the exporter needs to sign a contract with the importing country partner asserting environmentally sound management, proper management of residuals, and make a final report. So a contract, unfortunately, is just between two parties. They could be friends, they could be in cahoots with one another. The government doesn't get involved, the government doesn't get to see it, and any violation of a contract is a matter of civil law, not criminal, as per the Basel Convention requirements. So it's really way too cozy to just say you need a contract. Third requirement, the exporter must make a declaration that none of the equipment within the consignment is defined or considered to be a waste in any of the countries involved in the transport. And that's rather outrageous because it's completely inappropriate for a private business to make a declaration of law and assert compliance. That is just not okay, not done, not acceptable, and not really something a private person can do. So if they get caught, and they can just plead ignorance. I didn't know what the government requirements really were. That's not my thing. So number 4, ensure that each piece of equipment is individually protected against damage. Now that sounds like it has a little teeth to it, could cost you some money, but actually shrink wrap and cardboard separators can accommodate this. And compared to the amount of money you would make to do that quick adjustment, it's really not a useful criteria. And then finally, you need to have documentation to accompany the shipment as to the origin and nature of the equipment, the existence of the contract, and the declaration. But such documentation is easy to provide, but nobody's ever really going to be able to see it unless they just get lucky at the border. There's almost no country can open every shipment. So the burden is placed on the receiving countries to try to figure out, okay, which shipments might be containing electronic waste that's non-functional and hazardous, and it's being exempted from all controls because they're saying it's going to be repaired. And once they find out this documentation, they then have to check the veracity of it. So they have really no controls at their disposal, no transparency. So it's really not useful at all. So those are our concerns, and in summary, the flaws we've got, again, are because of the bad actors that we know exist that want to exploit weaker economies, and this is why the Basel Convention was created. So it can happen for recycling, it can happen for repair, that these exploitive operations will take place. People will find the way to exploit those loopholes. So you don't have the PIC procedure, the fundamental right to know and right of refusal. There's no ability to check on the exporters to see that they're legitimate. That's not going to happen. No ability to check on the repair operations. There's no formal registry of where these repair activities will take place. It's all in a cloak of contractual secrecy. So we can't even figure out the environmental fate, whether they're really doing full recycling or not. And of course, it violates the original intent of the ban amendment. So nobody ever conceived that these repairables that are hazardous, non-functional, would be exempt from the ban amendment. But suddenly, by virtue of a guideline, people are saying they are. And guidelines are not supposed to change a convention. They're just supposed to be an interpretation of what the convention does. So we have had some sympathy for the large manufacturers, particularly of large medical equipment, that they need to move things when they are dysfunctional. They need to move them to repair operations around the world nimbly. So we created at great time and cost a guideline that really solves the problem, gives a compromise, and we call it the Responsible Guideline for Ethical Circular Economy under the Basel Convention. And it's on our website if you want to look at it. But this is when we're talking about improving this loophole. This is what we mean. It basically requires that if you're going to do this, you have to tell us where it's going to be done and who's going to be doing it. It opens up the transparency and makes that a requirement that has to be posted on the Basel Convention website. So recently, the Bamako Convention at their third meeting, which is an African treaty dealing with the continent of Africa on the same subject as the Basel Convention, they said we want to remove paragraph 32 completely, not improve it, remove it. They passed a decision to do that. So there's a big pushback coming from parties. 28 countries are part of the Bamako Convention. And then at this last meeting, I mentioned 22 countries took the floor. saying we have to work on this. We do not want to adopt the technical guidelines as they are. We need to reform them. So I do think that there's going to be work on that going forward. And I do think there's going to be at least improvement, if not removal of that paragraph 32B, which creates this loophole. I'm not going to get into great depth on this today, but another means to close the repairables claim loophole is proposed by the EU and others to add an entry into Annex 4. Annex 4 is used to define what a waste is. And if there's a destination that's on Annex 4, then things going to that destination can be considered a waste. So the EU wants to add R20, which is a new R listing, which would be called preparation for reuse, repair and refurbishment, for example. So before it's been prepared for direct reuse, which would be a non-waste, they want to consider this a waste destination to close that loophole. And the reason for doing that, I can't seem to advance the slide here. Angelo, are you able to advance my slide? Oh, there we go. Why prepare for reuse Annex 4 entry makes sense. It's not advancing. There we go. It will ensure that the repairs will take place in an environmentally sound manner and in a responsible way, and actually take place and not just be claimed. It'll prevent the wholesale avoidance of the Basel Convention by unscrupulous traders and fake recyclers who have no intention of repairing anything. It ensures legitimate operators do not have to compete with these fake repair operations, which is extremely important to recyclers in North America, for example. And the PIC procedure provides the importing country with the ability to check on the fate of the shipments, the quality and age of the equipment, etc. Repair involves recycling or disposing of replaced parts in most cases. So export for repair is already seen by most to be covered under Annex 4 because you're going to have to dispose of the broken parts. And again, it violates the intent of the ban amendment if we don't have that covered as a waste destination. So that's a debate for the future. It didn't really get deep into it, although there was a discussion at COP15 about it, and the EU defended their position and we supported that defense. So the final subject before we get into questions is the reason people are not happy with Basel controls. One of the reasons, a legitimate reason, is that the PIC procedure has gotten to be a pain in the ass, so to speak. It's really arduous, and sometimes parties do not forward the paperwork. They just sit on it. So a company will say, I need to move this waste, and nothing will happen from the competent authorities for months and months. That is the complaint that we hear. And I'm trying to advance the slide, which is not, there we go. And these practical experiences with these problems have recently been documented by STEP, the partnership I mentioned earlier, a new independent review. So this is a good compilation of what's been going wrong with PIC around the world. Not to say it's all broken, but it has too many experiences in this way. And they put it on paper, which is really good because it's going to streamline how we attack the problem. I'm trying to advance. There we go. So what is the challenge again? Those horror stories I mentioned of taking many months to move the paperwork. The Article 6 of the convention, which is describing the PIC procedure, has some ambiguity. It has a lack of urgency in that there's no deadlines for moving things in some instances, and very few incentives to meet the deadlines, or very few consequences for not processing the paperwork. It's also clunky. You know, we've been using analog procedures, faxes, snail mail. That's how it's designed. It doesn't have a digital mechanism behind it. And having said that, we know that it will take years probably to amend the convention. So trying to change Article 6, which is the actual text of the convention, as a first step would not be wise. It could take years to actually get enough ratifications for it to enter into force. So the best thing to do is leave the definitions and the obligations alone and do something else. And so what we propose, and what seems to be happening at COP15 already, is getting painfully slow here. There we go. Is to do two things. And one is to create a digital PIC procedure, make things really easy and fun to fill out online, and include in that procedure real-time reminders and reporting to the parties via the Secretariat on how it's working. So we would be able to see, oh, there's a notification that hasn't been consented to and it's been 2 months. What's going on there? So just shining a light on the situation and reporting at every meeting about how things are working, because we'll have it all electronic and very easy to report on, would go a great distance toward actually getting compliance without having to change the treaty. The next thing we need to do is elaborate a best practices guidance document on how to best use that digital procedure. Where there's no deadlines, we would say this is the best practice, etc., and make that the standard. And that would be what would be looked at in terms of the digital reporting. We'd say, is this best practices really being followed by the parties? And then after you do those two things, we can see about amending the convention. So this is happening. There's a decision passed last week that creates a small intersessional working group to get the electronic procedure going. We think that the private sector is poised to do this in the best and fastest way. And so we've been in dialogue with ITI about this. They call it EPIC. And all they need is a party to sponsor them. And we've already got that organized. And I think the electronics manufacturers will come up with a really beautiful version of how to digitize Article 6, the PIC procedure. The other thing that's being done, again, is the best practices idea. The EU's proposed to get the ball rolling on the guidance to gather the thoughts and evidence from the parties. And so we have a decision on that that passed last week as well. So that's getting going. And then hopefully at some point people say, okay, let's start the long-term solution and take some of this experience and actually amend the convention. So that's my presentation for today. Sorry if it was too technical for some of you, but I know a lot of you recyclers really want to know what's allowed and what's not. And you can go back and review these slides and send me questions, but you can ask those questions now as well on Swiss-Ghana, the reparables loophole, or the PIC procedure. So Prema, I'm going to hand it back over to you, and you can help field the questions.
Okay, so if we have any questions, please raise your hand, or you can type it in the chat window. Angela, would you like to take over?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to check to see if you can hear me just fine.
Yep.
Fantastic. Okay, we have a question here from George. They ask, many of the plastic covers in electronics are made of PC/ABS. There is no way to separate these polymers as they are a blend. Will this output now be banned from export?
Well, they're going to be considered Y48 if they're removed from the electronics. If they're part of the electronics, they're going to be Y49. So both of those categories are Annex 2. And what that means in the US is that they're banned going to any Basel party or coming from any Basel party, unless you have a special, what they call an Article 11 agreement, which is why I talk about the OECD agreement a lot, because that's one of those. So if you are doing it in the OECD, that would be allowed. Unfortunately, the US objected to the OECD taking up the plastics Y48 category. So there you can only use Basel. There's one exception, that's the trade between US and Canada. So the US and Canada signed an independent deal, an Article 11 agreement that they claim is valid, and that will allow the trade between those two countries. But generally speaking, ABS mixed with polycarbonate, I think you said, is going to be considered a mixed plastic, and that puts it on Y48. So there'll be a lot of prohibitions when the US is involved. For other countries not involved in the US, it'll be prior informed consent.
Fantastic. We have a follow-up question by George. He says, while the changes and intent is good, how well can we expect the new rules to be enforced? Do countries have the resources available to enforce the new rules?
Well, unfortunately, I would love to say yes, but we've had 1 year now of the new plastics amendments, of them creating Y48. And I have to say, and we did a side event on this at the convention and put out a delegate alert about it, the enforcement is lacking from the developing country side, and certainly from US, which doesn't have to do it because they're not a party. But in countries like Malaysia, where they get a lot of this material, they're not checking the shipments. So we have been, as a watchdog, we have been telling them the shipments are coming. We actually can anticipate some of them from the data that we get. And we warn these countries that they need to take these containers off the ship and see if they're clean and unmixed, for example, with respect to plastic. So I'm afraid that there's going to be an enforcement lag. I'm hoping it's just a lag. But after 1 year, we're seeing very little enforcement with respect to the plastics amendments. So this is part of the reason why they extended the entry into force date a year longer than they did with plastics. They want countries to get ready for it. And so the entry into force date of Y49, the electronics, is going to be 2025. So January 1, 2025 gives an extra year, hopefully, for people to get ready to enforce it. But I hate to say that there's no guarantee this is going to be properly enforced. This is one of BAN's missions, is to make sure that happens.
Great. We have a question here that asks, will auto shredder residue be covered under the new rules?
Ew. Cars are not normally considered electronic waste, although that could be debated, I'm sure, nowadays. And so the auto fluff, I believe I'd have to do some double checking and get back to you on that. So if you could put your email into the chat or send me an extra one. I do believe they're going to be covered as a A-listed material. So it would be a hazardous waste, but I need to double check on that. I don't want to say something wrong here on the webinar, so I'll check on that.
Absolutely. Feel free to drop your email in the chat, and I will make sure that you are able to get in contact with Jim afterwards. We have a question here that says, what's the likely timeline for the digital pick? Tom asks this.
Wow. This is why I want the electronics industry to do it, because if you put it into a committee of a lot of countries, it's just going to be taking forever. So everyone's going to second guess every single thing. Just give it to a bunch of nerds and let them translate Article 6 into digital operation. It's not that hard. It's very similar to e-commerce that we already do. It's not that complicated. So once we get that going, without having to have it, completely pulled apart by a committee, we can test it. And we've got countries lined up already to volunteer to test it. So we'd send a box or a barrel, and inside the barrel it would say, I am Y48, or I am hazardous waste electronics. And we will move it around the world and test the whole system and see that the electronic reporting is working and all that. So that pilot, we'll call it, can happen very quickly. The adoption of it by this special working group is another matter. But if you have something that's working and the parties that are piloting are going, this is great, it'll really accelerate things much faster than usual with negotiations. So I do think that's the way to go. But to answer your question, to be realistic, it's not going to happen before probably 4 years in terms of
Great.
official adoption of it. Yeah.
Great response. We have a question here by Jason asking, maybe I missed it. What about leaded glass for recycling?
Leaded glass is considered a hazardous waste. Doesn't mean it can't be recycled, but it will be controlled. That's a definite. That's been there for a long time and will continue to be there. So you can move it if it's prior informed consent and they're Basel parties. But the US will not be able to move it across the border without it being part of the OECD group. So they can move it to OECD countries.
Great. We have a question here by Joe. I believe it was with the previous questions on polycarbonates or ABS, and they're asking, how is this different than selling polycarbonates or ABS?
Well, you mean as a commodity new product? Well, the waste is obviously going to be considered different, largely because used stuff is going to be potentially contaminated and have all those additives in it we don't know what they are. This is the problem with plastics, is any given waste stream, you don't even know what the additives are. So it makes it particularly problematic. So the Basel Convention obviously doesn't control commodities, even though there's a lot of commodities that have hidden hazards. It can only control what's considered a waste, and that's something going to an Annex 4 destination. So that's the difference. Maybe it's not a precisely scientific difference if you had it really clean, but the difference is the scope of the convention is only on waste, and they don't touch commodities. But I think the rationale for that I've mentioned is that waste is more likely to have a contaminant or an unknown.
Fantastic. We have a comment from Joe. It wasn't a question, but a comment talking about the auto shredder residue, stating that they believe it is a mixed plastic and banned.
Yeah, so it could be considered that. I just want to double check that there's not an A listing or a B listing for it. I think there is. I don't want to interrupt the meeting to grab my convention and dig into it, but I'll certainly answer this question later. But yeah, you could consider it, and a competent authority has the prerogative to say, okay, I think it's this listing or that listing. And they can say this is a Y48 mixed plastic, and therefore would have to require prior informed consent normally, but with the US involved, it's a ban to going to Basel parties because of the non-party to party trade ban in the convention. The only way to surmount that non-party to party rule is through what's called an Article 11 agreement, which has to be as strong as the Basel Convention and has to be registered. So US has a few of those. They have one with Mexico, they have one with Canada, and they have the OECD agreement, for example. And they have a smattering of other ones for importing waste from countries like Malaysia. But that's how it would have to be done. And yeah, that's, if you're on Annex 2, the default is a PIC procedure, but the non-party party trade ban does apply as well.
Fantastic. To answer someone's question in the questions, the recording for the webinar will be available right afterwards. We'll be sending out an email. We'll also have it on our website and YouTube. So feel free to check that there, maybe in about an hour or so. But yeah, moving on to the next question. We have, what is the impact of these changes on the ability to export working components intended to be incorporated in other devices for refurbishment or resale?
So these are used components and they're functional. I think that's what I'm hearing. And if that's the case, they are not a waste. They're going to direct reuse, they're not a waste. If they're going for repair, they would be. So, of course, the caveat is the final resolution of this repairables loophole. In our view, they should be considered a waste if they're going for repair. But again, the technical guideline has carved out an exception to that with those 5 criteria I mentioned. I do think that eventually that loophole will be closed, at least partially, so that'll have a little more controls on it. But if you've got material that you have tested and identified as working components, then you're outside the scope of the Basel Convention. And you don't have those controls to worry about. Of course, you have to declare that it is, you have to show that you've tested it, or have some other way to demonstrate that it's working. And then you can satisfy your competent authorities that that is not a waste.
Fantastic. We have a question here from Andrew asking, was there any talks at your last convention about manufacturers using recycled plastics or safe plastics when manufacturing electronics going forward?
The idea of post-consumer plastics wasn't brought up, and those kind of mandates for post-consumer content and things like that are not being discussed at the Basel Convention, except in perhaps the partnership. But I have to tell you, it's getting more and more controversial. As we look at plastics more closely, we realize that the recyclability of plastic is fraught with all kinds of problems. Once we open our eyes to the fact that we have to think about the additives and the fact that there's going to be additives that are inappropriate to put into new products, and the control of those additives is almost impossible. You don't know what's in every piece of waste that you're recycling. You don't know what the impacts are if you put brominated flame retardants into toys, into food grade materials, and the phthalates, etc., the heavy metal additives. And any given amount of plastic, you don't know the plastic waste, what's in there. The additives are not tiny percentages either. They're often, in 20, 30% are additives of some of the polymers and some of the plastic products. And they differ by whatever product you're putting out there, and every brand, and whatever year it might be a different additive. So I think there's more and more scrutiny, and I think it's the idea of always pushing for post-consumer plastic is fraught with a lot of problems, which are coming to a head now. And I think those issues are going to make the idea of plastic recycling a lot more dubious. As more we look into plastic, and that's the subject for another webinar, it's not inherently a circular material. I would really like to see more and more electronics made of just metals if possible, to start phasing out plastics, even if it's post-consumer plastics, because they are fraught with so many problems at end of life and even during recycling. But that's definitely a controversial subject and a subject for another webinar.
Fantastic and insightful response there, Jim. We have a question here asking, what position do you think ISRI is going to take on the changes? And please describe what ISRI means.
Yeah, ISRI is the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries. They've had BAN and ISRI have had a long history of butting heads on issues of trade. They don't like trade barriers of any kind with respect to recycling trade historically. And of course, we are trying to prevent the trade that externalizes costs to weaker economies. So we've had a natural battle going on, but more and more, I think, like ISRI did not take the floor ever to oppose the Swiss-Ghanaian proposal. There was very little opposition to it, where in the past, I think they would have been much more strong and pushing against it. The manufacturers also did not oppose it. In fact, it had no opposition, the Swiss-Ghanaian proposal. And it's definitely a trade barrier for the environment. So whether Israel will accept the US ratification of the Basel Convention and start to look at things a little from a slightly different perspective is an open question. I recently attended the Israel conference for the first time this last conference, had a good dialogue with a lot of electronics recyclers there, and I do see an opening for compromising on some of these issues.
Fantastic. As a reminder, if anyone has questions, feel free to please raise your hand. Use the hand raise function and we can unmute you. At the moment, we don't have any questions, but I'll just wait a moment here to see if any trickle in. I do have one question for you, Mr. Puckett. What would you say would be one of your takeaways from the conference?
Yeah, so I didn't talk about other issues other than e-waste. Briefly, I'll say that plastics is the big subject there at the moment, even more than e-waste, and people are educating themselves about how chemical recycling is not really viable, and it's more in the area of a myth at this moment. It's not really happening, and so that was an important piece. The issue of legacy plastics, post-consumers, etc. Plastics was being talked about. A lot of the side events were about plastic. But on the electronics issue, it's the two things. It's the Swiss-Ghana was the big news, and the other big news is that 22 countries, in addition to the Bamako parties, all developing countries are not happy with this reparables loophole, and they want to tighten it up or eliminate it. So that is going to be the next debate, I believe, going forward. And whether they do it through the guideline or through the annex will be a big part of the discussion.
Fantastic. We have one final question here in the chat. Rick asks, what are your expectations on US Basel ratification?
Oh, I've learned not to hold my breath or say anything about my expectations there because, yeah, I thought it would happen many, many years ago. Every time it looks promising, back in the Clinton administration, it was really close. It didn't happen. And so even though there's some senators out there that are trying to get it done, particularly with new impetus from the plastics issue, I still am not going to hold my breath. We have a dysfunctional Congress to start with. I do think it's probably going to need Senate advice and consent again, because this is a very different treaty than it was back when they got advice and consent before. The Ban Amendment is now part of the treaty, and the US has always opposed the Ban Amendment. They will now have to accept the Ban Amendment because it's part and parcel of the treaty they would be ratifying. So that and many other reasons doesn't look promising. Of course, we support it because now the Ban Amendment is part of the treaty and they'll have to accept that important agreement. And times change. I think it really makes sense for the US to be part of it. So we would support that if it was ratified properly. But yeah, I can't predict or hope or take a breath one way or the other on that one.
Fantastic. We have no more further questions, so I'll let you finish off here with any last words.
Yeah, thank you everybody for these fantastic questions. I'll get back on the auto fluff. Maybe we can put it under the link where we have the recording. But that could be easily answered. I just am not prepared to say one way or the other on that until I dig in a little bit, as I'm sure you appreciate. But any other questions you can think of, which I'm sure you will over time, just shoot them our way and we'll study them for you and give you our best answers. Thanks for attending, everybody. I really enjoyed it.